On a brisk autumn afternoon in New York's sprawling Central Park, amber leaves pirouette through the cool air as Harold Jenkins, a 74-year-old retired educator, sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench beside a glistening lake. Clad in his time-worn tweed jacket and flat cap, he was as much a part of the park as the ancient oaks, a daily ritual of feeding pigeons, immersing himself in dog-eared paperbacks, and absorbing the last lingering rays of a fading sun. His lined face, etched with decades of stories and silent wisdom, spoke of a life lived fully. That day, his eyes danced over the familiar pages of a classic novel he had once taught to countless inquisitive minds. And just when the gentle cadence of his solitude should have remained undisturbed. Without warning, the quiet was shattered by the heavy tread of two police officers, Officer Riley Carter and Officer Brad Lewis, whose boots drummed harshly on the gravel. Their stern visages fell like dark clouds upon his peaceful reverie as one barked, "What are you doing here, old-timer? You match the description of a suspect we're after." Startled yet composed, Harold murmured, "I'm sorry, officers, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm simply enjoying the day." But the officers, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, demanded identification. As Harold fumbled into his pocket, his arthritic hand trembling, the impatient Carter seized him roughly by the arm, sending his cherished book tumbling to the ground with a clatter that echoed through the park. A murmur of disquiet rippled through a growing crowd of joggers, hand-in-hand couples, and an elderly lady with her dog, all capturing the unfolding drama on their phones. "Why are you treating me this way?" Harold pleaded, his voice quivering with a mix of confusion and fear, just as Carter sneered, "Stop resisting," and Lewis forcefully shoved him back onto the bench. The day's calm had evaporated into a moment of stark brutality, and the real test of conscience was about to begin. From the far end of the path emerged a figure in a dark coat and scarf, a presence as unexpected as a lighthouse in a storm. Morgan Freeman, the revered actor and tireless advocate for fairness, had stepped into the park after a nearby charity event, seeking solace in nature's embrace amidst urban clamor. His keen eyes took in the disturbing scene, an elderly man, his dignity trampled by rough-handed authority. With calm authority, Morgan approached and said, "Excuse me, officers, what seems to be the problem here?" His measured tone cut through the tension like a cool breeze through the summer heat. Officer Carter, visibly irritated, retorted dismissively, "This doesn't concern you, sir. Please move along." Yet Morgan's steadfast gaze did not waver. "It matters deeply when an innocent soul is treated as a criminal," he challenged. Turning slowly to the battered Harold, who still clutched his chest in pain, he asked, "Does this frail man appear dangerous? Does he deserve such harshness?" The questioning tone reverberated among the onlookers, as whispers and raised phones testified to an escalating collective outrage. Just as voices in the crowd began to swell, a distant wail of sirens hinted that the tide of fate was about to turn. A sleek black and white patrol car screeched to a halt, and from it stepped Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned officer whose reputation for fairness and justice shone as brightly as the morning sun. With a piercing gaze that seemed to dissect the truth, she demanded, "What is going on here?" Officer Carter straightened, stammering that they were detaining a man matching a suspect's description. Mitchell arched an eyebrow and coolly inquired, "Did you verify this before roughing him up in front of half the park?" Approval murmured from the growing crowd as Morgan's presence lent undeniable weight to Harold's plight. Rising to her full commanding stature, Lieutenant Mitchell directed, "Officers, remove those restraints immediately." Although Carter began to protest, her tone brooked no argument. With reluctant hands, Officer Lewis released Harold's reddened, swollen wrists. Kneeling beside him, Mitchell's voice softened, "I'm deeply sorry for what happened today. This is not how our duty is meant to serve." Harold, barely managing a weak nod, whispered, "I just want to go home." As Mitchell turned her stern attention to the officers, warning they would accompany her back to the precinct for a serious discussion, a surge of applause from the bystanders rippled through the park. Morgan, ever the quiet guardian, helped Harold to his feet, carefully retrieving his fallen cap and whispering, "Come on, Harold, let's get you home." Their departure, captured by countless cameras, marked the end of one ordeal and the uneasy prelude to another. In the gentle hum of a taxi weaving through New York City's bustling streets, Harold sat silently in the passenger seat of Morgan Freeman's car. The afternoon sun cast elongated shadows across the dashboard as Harold gripped his tweed cap with trembling hands. "Thank you, Mr. Freeman," he murmured softly, his voice laced with both gratitude and lingering disbelief. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened." Morgan's steady gaze met his, the lines of concern and resolve etching his face as he replied, "You don't need to thank me, Harold. What happened was simply wrong. No one deserves to be treated this way, especially not someone like you." Soon, the car pulled up before a modest brownstone in Harlem. With gentle assistance, Morgan helped Harold down the steps, the quiet dignity of the moment punctuated by an invitation, "Would you care to come in for some tea?" Harold's voice, imbued with quiet gratitude, answered, "I'd like that very much." And as they entered the snug, book-lined living room, a haven perfumed with the scent of old paper and a hint of Earl Grey, their conversation began to weave together the threads of personal injustice and the larger tapestry of systemic failure. Yet even as Harold recounted how he was seen as just another old face, indistinguishable in the eyes of those quick to judge, the steady ticking of a wall clock underscored the weight of history repeating itself. In a silence heavy with unspoken truths, Morgan's low, resolute voice broke through, "It's an old tale, Harold, one told too often, but not one we must accept." Meanwhile, far from the humble comfort of Harlem, the atmosphere at the police precinct simmered with tension. Under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, Lieutenant Mitchell sat across from Officers Carter and Lewis, her voice as sharp as a drawn blade. "Do either of you have anything to say for yourselves?" she demanded. With arms crossed and voices defensive, they insisted they were merely doing their job, citing that the man matched a suspect's description. But Mitchell slammed a file onto the table, scattering photographs that revealed Harold's bruised wrists, the terror in his eyes, a stark contradiction to any notion of criminality. "That man was no suspect," she declared, "but a retired schoolteacher who has known this city far longer than you have." As the room filled with a palpable sense of accountability, Mitchell continued, "Your abuse of power has not only endangered a citizen but has ignited the attention of an entire community." The tension mounted as she announced the immediate suspension of the officers, the case now being forwarded to the district attorney for further legal action. In the precinct's lobby, reporters and protesters had already gathered, their voices rising in unison, an unmistakable declaration that justice was demanded and that this breach of trust would not be swept away without consequence. As evening draped Harlem in a mellow, amber glow, Morgan and Harold found solace together in a quiet moment of reflection. The fading light cast delicate shadows across their faces as Harold confessed, "I've witnessed protests, riots, marches, yet every time we take one step forward, events like today push us 2 steps back." Morgan leaned forward, his tone both gentle and resolute. "Change is rarely a straight path, Harold. It's messy, painful, and often slow. But each act of speaking out, each refusal to ignore injustice, slowly chips away at the very foundations of oppression." In that soft-spoken exchange, a flicker of hope shone through the somber memories of the day. Then, as if to punctuate his words, Morgan's phone vibrated, a message from Lieutenant Mitchell confirming that the officers had been suspended and a formal investigation was underway. "Thank you for stepping in today, Mr. Freeman," the message read, and with a nod to fate, Harold exhaled a long-held breath of relief. "It's a start," he whispered. Morgan placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and said, "Rest, Harold. Tomorrow brings new challenges, and we'll need every ounce of strength for what lies ahead." Outside, as the city lights flickered on and distant sirens sang their forlorn tune, Morgan pulled his scarf tighter and stepped into the night, knowing that while this chapter might be closing, the story of resistance and hope was only just beginning. At dawn, Harold awoke to the clamor of voices and the distant hum of news vans outside his Harlem brownstone. From his window, he observed a throng of reporters, activists, and neighbors gathered, placards held high with slogans like "Justice for Harold" and "End Police Brutality" fluttered in the early light. Clutching his curtain in trembling hands, Harold sighed deeply. It had been years since he'd been thrust into the spotlight, and the weight of unwanted attention unsettled him. A sudden knock at the door startled him, and when he opened it, there stood Morgan Freeman, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Morning, Harold." "It seems the world woke up with us today," Morgan said kindly, offering 1 cup. With hesitant gratitude, Harold accepted, murmuring, "It's overwhelming. I'm just a retired schoolteacher, not built for all this." Morgan's reassuring grip on his shoulder affirmed, "You didn't ask for any of this, Harold. But sometimes, ordinary people are cast into extraordinary circumstances, and we must rise to the moment." Outside, as a fragile hope began to swell, the winds of change were already stirring, whispers of accountability resonating from every corner. Back at the NYPD headquarters, the air was thick with anticipation as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium before a sea of flashing cameras and chattering reporters. Clearing her throat with deliberate authority, she announced, "Good morning. After reviewing witness testimonies, video evidence, and internal reports, I can confirm that Officers Carter and Lewis flagrantly violated department protocols and abused their authority during today's incident involving Mr. Jenkins. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, punctuated by a sharp cry, "What happens now?" Mitchell's jaw tightened as she continued, "Both officers have been formally terminated. Their reckless actions have betrayed not only this department but also the community we are sworn to protect. The case has been referred to the district attorney's office for further legal proceedings." As cheers erupted from protesters outside, she added, "We also acknowledge the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to persist. Henceforth, the department will implement sweeping reforms, mandatory de-escalation training, enhanced community engagement, and stringent transparency measures, including public access to body camera footage within 48 hours of any forceful incident." At the back of the room, Morgan's calm yet approving nod affirmed that today's reckoning was only the beginning of a broader movement for justice. That very afternoon, a community forum in Harlem filled an old gymnasium with a mosaic of faces, parents, elders, activists, and hopeful citizens united by a common cause. Invited to speak, Harold hesitated as he adjusted the microphone, the spotlight an unfamiliar weight upon his modest frame. Yet with a deep breath, he began, "I never imagined I'd be standing before all of you. I spent decades teaching literature and lessons of justice, only to feel utterly powerless that day in the park. But when a stranger stood up for me, I realized I was seen." The room fell silent, save for the hum of fluorescent lights, before erupting in heartfelt applause as tears welled in his eyes. Then Morgan stepped up, his resonant voice filling the space as he proclaimed, "What happened to Harold isn't an isolated incident, it's a systemic injustice." Today, however, was different. People did not simply record what they witnessed, they demanded accountability. "This is what gives me hope. Even in our darkest moments, there are those who dare to light a candle." His words, stirring and unyielding, underscored a truth: real change isn't a fleeting headline but a relentless movement that begins with each individual voice declaring, "Enough is enough." And as the forum's energy soared, it became clear that this collective stand was destined to spark ripples of transformation far beyond Harlem. In the ensuing weeks, the incident in Central Park ignited a national conversation. News outlets broadcast interviews with Harold, Morgan, and Lieutenant Mitchell. Protests demanding police reform and accountability blossomed in cities across the country. Social media exploded with hashtags like "Justice for Harold" and "Change Starts Now," while reform measures took root within the police force, ushering in civilian oversight boards, updated transparency policies, and comprehensive retraining of officers. Harold's quiet resilience turned him into an emblem of hope. Neighbors greeted him warmly on the streets, and a local artist immortalized the saga with a mural depicting Harold and Morgan beneath the words "Justice begins with courage." Yet even as accolades and promises of reform poured in, the deeper work of healing and change had only just begun. One crisp evening, back at the park where it all started, Harold and Morgan found themselves seated once more on that familiar bench. The skyline shimmered with distant city lights, and the gentle lapping of the lake whispered secrets of past struggles. "I think something good has emerged from all this," Harold murmured, gazing out at the water. Morgan's eyes softened as he replied, "Yes, but the journey is far from over. The fight for justice is relentless, it's messy, and it demands persistence. Every time we stand up, every time we refuse to be invisible, we inch closer to a better tomorrow." In a quiet moment of reflection, Harold recalled a cherished line from a book he'd taught for years: "Real courage is when you know you're defeated before you begin, yet you still forge ahead." Morgan smiled gently, adding, "And you, Harold, have embodied that courage today." As night deepened and the sounds of the city mingled with the gentle rustle of leaves, the two men sat in companionable silence, a testament to the power of one voice, one act, to ignite change. Their story was a flame that, though flickering, could never be extinguished. Each whispered promise of hope a stepping stone toward a more just world.